Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 36th episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. In this episode, I'd like to discuss materialism. Oops. Materialism as sort of an ideology, what role it played in our evolution, going beyond materialism, and in general, how I position myself and the experience I had with this belief system. So here are the things that I'll discuss. So first, just a little anecdote. Probably as many of you, I get into occasionally I get into debates with other people on plenty of different topics, be it on Facebook or YouTube or Reddit, and then it's just back and forth argumentation. And recently, I came across a post of a friend which was against 5G. And then obviously there's a materialist kind of guy that posts a message debunking the fact that 5G is harmless. And so I try to weigh in. And of course, I do my spiel, I explain a certain number of things. But because of course, I'm not a scientist, I didn't go studying science, I use the bad terminology. So basically, I'm saying, for instance, I say a lot of things about the fact that ultimately the big problem with 5G is that you can never prove that it's harmless because, first of all, you don't have a control group since everyone is exposed to it. Then, how do you find a control group that is not exposed to 5G and compare the two to compare, if they're kind of like more cancers or more problems? Since everyone is exposed to 5G, it's very difficult to do. Second thing is longitudinal studies. We don't have 30 plus years to see the effects of 5G on health. If you look at smoking, for instance, um, in some people, you will not notice any effects or any really noticeable effects until 30 years plus when their lungs are really, really filthy and filled with, muck and plenty of toxins and toxic products. So, for those two reasons, it's not even possible to make any kind of affirmation about whether 5G is harmful or not. But then in my explanation of all these methodological problems, I use the term radiation as opposed to electromagnetic waves. And so the guy just completely destroys me, saying I'm talking about radiation like this is some kind of nuclear thing, and that I'm just I'm just completely talking nonsense and completely ignoring the whole methodological, explanation that I'm giving. And so the lesson that I took away from that is that I've been subject to this temptation that materialism provides us in this day and age of a truth, a methodology for imposing a certain point of view on people. You see, every period in history, be it tribalism or monotheist religions or materialism, grants certain powers to the people that live in those days and abide by those beliefs and majority to, impose truth, sort of an official truth, a sort of authority over others and power. which is very tempting to yield. So, as long as you abide, for instance, by a certain number of rules in tribalism, for instance, you do the right rituals and the ancestors tell you that somebody's wrong, or that you have to go hunting now and not tomorrow, or that rains are going to come, then the whole tribe sort of listens to you and you now have power. In monotheist religions, which is about the situation about 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago, when you were a part of the clergy and you went through a certain number of rituals, like you were an official bishop or something, and you've gone up the hierarchy of the official church, then you also had power to impose a certain number of truths on people, because the truths are in this one book. There's the Bible, and that's the word of God. And then, therefore, because you've done, the number of rituals that you're supposed to do, then you are the wielder of truth, and you can impose. You have the authority to, and you have the power to impose that truth on others. And materialism is the same thing. Today, materialism, there's a certain methodology, which is a scientific method. There is the ritual, which is, you have a PhD in whatever, nuclear physics or science or chemistry, whatever. So you have an official degree from university. And when you put the two together, you have authority and power over people. And when you grow up in a paradigm like that, it's very tempting to try to wield it to manipulate other people's knowledge and beliefs, and engage in these kind of debates to win over others, to have power over others and authority, and exert a certain authority and imposing truth in a certain way. And so, you see, I think what the universe is trying to teach me a lesson is that, first of all, I didn't go through the right rituals. I don't have a PhD in any kind of scientific background. I only have the regular high school sort of knowledge that anybody has, knowing the basics. But also that it's no longer the day and age for playing these kind of games of trying to prove your point and exert authority and power over others by winning them over via a truth that is unquestionable. Because that's the whole point, right? I mean, tribalism is unquestionable until it becomes questionable when you move on to monotheism. And then monotheism is unquestionable until you get to materialism. And then spirituality, is a kind of evolution of materialism. But the danger is, if you bring this mindset of trying to again reproduce the same kind of thing with methodology and the kind of the right rituals, then to wield power and authority over others, then perhaps this is not the right time for that. And so in spirituality, that is, the methodology is, for instance, channeling. The right rituals is, for instance, having a Kundalini awakening. Or sort of an initiation, shamanic rituals, whatever, and there's plenty of different things that where you can just say I've done this, I've done that, I've experienced this, and I've experienced that, and then it gives you again power, authority to impose certain number of truths. Of course, in today's spiritual circles, you often hear the phrase, if it resonates, or it's just my guides are telling me. That's also one way of sort of well, not manipulate people, but it's just these recurring things that you're saying where it's not you speaking anymore. It's not just a regular human giving his opinion. Right now, it's actually Jesus, for instance, speaking through me. So, but what's the point in in saying that? What is the point? Um, I really like the saying of one spiritual teacher that I was following. That I had I went to a sort of a week of this kind of rituals of initiation, if you want, working on the ego, working on other things. And he was saying that ultimately, you could be speaking to your toilet paper, and it contained the same kind of information as connecting to your guides, because ultimately the information is everywhere in every single particle, because every single particle is connected to everything else. And in every single particle, there's it's sort of like in its quantum state, it has lived everything. That particle from that toilet paper has also been a particle in the body of Jesus, and is going to be a particle in somebody else's, some all the spiritual teachers' bodies. Everyone, I mean, everything is connected. Everything. So the Akashic records are known to be everywhere, in the empty space between everything. And so it doesn't really matter what you speak to. The information is everywhere. But when you're saying my toilet paper said that we should do this or that, um, what legitimacy do you think you have, and how seriously are people going to take your word? Whereas when you say, well, Jesus said, we have to do this or that. And so the same kind of temptation, there's always this temptation of um, using whatever works in your day and age, in your paradigm, to take power and authority and impose truths on others. And it's really tempting, and the universe is basically telling me, first of all, stop it, because you're not a scientist, so don't even try. And that is the problem, is that when you've grown up in materialism, I mean, I was an atheist until I had my spiritual awakening, and so I had a materialist understanding of reality, and it's very hard to transcend that, and it's very hard to forego the temptation that goes with this methodology for imposing truths, because that's what science tells you, is that there is an objective truth, and if you do the right things, then you can be right and the other people are wrong. You won, you're on the podium, you're number one, everybody else loses, and your point of view wins, and you're the victor, and you get a Nobel Prize, and blah 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 blah. So it is very tempting, but we have to go beyond that. And so I'm struggling with that. And now, especially transitioning from materialism to spirituality, also to be able to not take this reflex with me of, and fortunately, because, well, fortunately or unfortunately, because I do not experience the information that I'm, you know, receiving, I guess, but I don't even experience any receiving. I just talk. Um, because I cannot say this person or that alien, whatever tribe told me this or that, then I cannot play this game of my guides or the Pleiadians or whatever, because I have no idea. And so the universe is giving me an opportunity to go towards spirituality from materialism, but ditch this whole sort of process of um, trying to wield authority, power, and impose truths every time you move on to another paradigm. But let's put materialism into context. It was very useful for our evolution and for the evolution of the universe, because materialism as as a belief system is very interesting for experimentation because it's experimentation because its fundamental assumption is that ultimately this whole universe um, could have appeared by chance, and all of the randomness of the events led by chance also for this planet to have exactly the Goldilocks condition for life to emerge. But the whole evolutionary process was also um, just sort of a randomness that led to, fortunately, to something like the emergence of us, um, beings with human beings with consciousness from apes. But can you imagine? Well, first of all, that is the longest timeline timeline of experimentation that you can think of. Because what's longer than randomness and chance? If you take the monotheist, for instance, belief, and we have stuck to that, then the universe, I mean, how many incarnations can you fit in? The universe was created 6,000 years ago. Well, not many. And so the universe is like, well, okay, I've incarnated into about 100 generations of animals and about 100 generations of humans. Especially if you read the Bible, some of them lived to be 900 years old. So that doesn't provide a lot of leeway for experimentation and incarnation into different experiences. But the moment we come up with materialism as an explanation, suddenly the amount of experimentation that can happen and the amount of things that can be experimented and experienced as far as animals, plants, rocks, everything is brilliant. It's just that at a certain point, it's a dead end. Just like everything is a dead end ultimately. Any belief system reaches a dead end and it has to move on. It has to evolve, move forward. So there is a dead end to materialism, and we're feeling it all right now. If we pursue on keeping the materialist belief, then what we'll have is climate change and all these things, because those will inevitably befall us if we view the world through a materialist lens. And I mean, if people had stuck to monotheism, for instance, and we never moved on to materialism, then people today would be experiencing the apocalypse as it was described in the Bible, which is also a kind of a dead end for experimentation. So, in order for the experience to continue, well, we just have to move on. Now, going beyond materialism, though, is probably not my calling, specifically because I'm not a scientist again. And that should be left to real scientists that can make that bridge between materialism and spirituality, like Rupert Sheldrake, for instance, which I mention all the time because I really find his ideas really, really interesting. And they are a nice way to bridge science and materialism and spirituality. Um, but from the point of view of someone that has mastered the vocabulary, the terminology, and that has gone through the right rituals and everything, to be viewed as legitimate. And even he is completely, sidelined by the scientific community. So can you imagine someone like me that doesn't even have the right rituals, doesn't even have the right methodology or the right terminology? I just use materialist concepts because it's unavoidable. I've grown up in them, and so I have to talk. I talk about atoms, I talk about photons, I talk about all those things, but I use them mostly in an allegorical way to make comparisons, metaphors, and all these things, which is completely would be completely laughed at by the scientific community if they came across my videos and my ideas. But that's to be expected. Um, that's to be expected, of course. So my role, I think, is more in building bridges. First, help those that are like me. So people that have grown up in materialism have a it's like a basic understanding of science, but sort of stumble upon spirituality. They've never come across spirituality, and suddenly they feel lost, completely lost. And that's what I experienced basically when I had my spiritual awakening. I completely lost ground. I mean, nothing. I mean, it's almost like I couldn't figure out what was true, what was false. I ended up in the emergency psychiatric unit in the hospital, by the way, because I thought the end of the world was here, and I was shifting through dimensions. I mean, it was just complete chaos. Because obviously, if you have nothing to hold on to, your materialist lens sort of blows up, and you discover that there is actually something like a God, but you've never read a single spirituality book. Then you have nothing, no structure to sort of land on your feet, and that's very dangerous. And that's what I experienced. So that's the first thing. The second thing is live my new truth, and that is start practicing things that are linked to spirituality. Like, for instance, I'm doing these exercises with my hands to form a sort of a bubble of energy and feeling it, feeling when I put my hands closer, feeling as if it were an actual physical balloon, and doing plenty of different exercises with that. Testing, for instance, the positive vibes or not of food, like with my right hand, like approaching it and seeing if the energy field that comes from that food is actually expanding my own field, as in it's good food. And so I take something rotten, I test it, doing plenty of experiments like this, doing card readings. I mean, I've done card readings with my own decks. All of these things is actually living these newfound truths in my own way. Doing meditation, for instance. I've done a first initiation in Kriya Yoga, for instance. All of these things are small steps to help this transition. And then building bridges is also building bridges between these ideas. And for anyone to who is willing to cross them, to make it easier for them, especially in understanding that ultimately none of this is right or wrong, or more true or less true. It is just an interface or a belief system which allows you to navigate inside infinite potential in a certain way. So tribalism enables certain experiences within an infinity. Monotheism the same, materialism the same, and spirituality. And so it's more integration of all of them than replacing one with the other. Um, Finally, I'd like to talk about Gaia's shift. And I put Santa Claus here because ultimately it's almost like the kind of shift you're experiencing when you're like, what, 4 or 5, and you start realizing that Santa Claus does not exist, or not as your parents have led you to believe. And you are in that kind of shift between two sets of beliefs where your old ones are still there, new ones are coming in. It's almost like you're in between two software versions. Like you're in beta. Like it's you're not fully out of Windows 7 or whatever, and you're not fully in Windows 10. You're kind of in this beta version or alpha version of the new paradigm. And I had this metaphor which came to me of Gaia's shift as being almost as if Gaia was the computer, the hardware, which was being upgraded. And so once the hardware is upgraded, if the software doesn't follow, then it's incompatible and has to sort of break down. So as you know, for instance, so let's assume that materialist lens, is like MS-DOS. Now, as you know, MS-DOS, for instance, if you try to run MS-DOS on a computer which has like a 2 terabyte drive and 64 gigabytes of RAM, and a 8-core processor, well, that's not going to work because MS-DOS has never been configured or geared towards recognizing or being able to take advantage of those components. See? Um, and so obviously what's going to do is at some point it'll break down, and it's people are using different language, of course. They'll say that people will leave or die and go to planets that resonate with their vibration or whatever. But ultimately they'll go to planets where the hardware is compatible with the software. Or in other words, the planet is compatible with their level of beliefs, and the state that they have sort of achieved. But it's not right or wrong. I mean, MS-DOS is not any more right or wrong or any more true than Windows 10. It's just a certain interface that allows you to have a certain experience and not another. Um, and by the way, this is also a nice way of having this metaphor of integration, because obviously, even in Windows 10, oops, you can bring up the command line, which is MS-DOS, inside Windows 10. Of course, nobody bothers to do it because it's really only for geeks and doing certain geeky stuff, which is probably, by the way, what Pleiadians are doing, or Jesus when they're communicating with us. They are in a very, very higher, much higher kind of, or more complex interface, which allows them to navigate across space and time and do plenty of different things, 5D, 10D, whatever. And then they can bring up within that kind of software or understanding or interface this little command line where they can send us very basic information that they're trying to translate from their level through the command line. And they're like, my God, how am I going to formulate this? How am I going to send the very complex information of what's happening in my interface through the CMD into their level of consciousness? And they're like, oh, wow, so much is going to be lost. I mean, just imagine how programs look like in Windows 10, and a simple manipulation like copy paste, for instance, which is just a click of a button. How do you actually translate that into a CMD command line thing? It becomes really something much more complex, or even just dragging and dropping a file somewhere. I mean, how much more complex is it in a command line interface? And so Gaia's shift is kind of that. That's the way that I'm seeing it, is that the hardware is just being upgraded because, it has its limits, the hard drive's full, the processor is just burning and blah, blah, blah. So the planet's saying, okay, I'll just update it. I'll add a few gigs of RAM. I'll change the motherboard and whatever. But then it's like, oh, but the people living on it better upgrade their software or they won't be able to stay very long. So I hope you found this video interesting. And for my YouTube live, maybe I'll mention it at the beginning of the video next time. But I've planned to do my first one on Monday at 2:40 p.m. CET, Central Eastern Time. So that's Paris, Berlin, Brussels, Amsterdam. So hope to see you there, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and hope we can interact for my first live soon. Bye-bye.